Ever wondered why Britain stayed lean in the 1960s without gyms, fad diets, or calorie trackers? We didn't do a bunch of things we do today to stay fit, like fearing fat, counting calories, and looking at motivational videos, but somehow we were effortlessly skinny in the 1960s without even trying. What secret was it that kept us that way, and what habits did we lose? Well, back then, dinner time was sacred and families gathered around the table sharing food, stories and laughter. Meals were simple, wholesome and satisfying, with fresh ingredients taking centre stage. In this video, we'll explore the habits, lifestyle choices and cultural practices that naturally kept people slim. From the food they ate to the way they moved through daily life, these are the reasons we don't see as often today. Let's start by looking at homemade meals, the foundation of a naturally lean 1960s Britain. So back then, the typical kitchen didn't have a stock of ready-to-eat meals that you can pop in the microwave. Back then, almost every dish was either prepared from scratch or using leftovers with ingredients that came from home gardens or the local market. We had a bunch of fresh veggies, seasonal fruits, dairy products and freshly cut meat. The processed stuff was quite expensive, and so it was rarely used, the opposite of today where fresh and all natural ingredients are expensive. This reliance on whole foods meant that meals were naturally balanced with carbs, proteins and fats in healthier proportions compared to today's heavily processed food. While people do still make meals at home, the frequency is less than before since most families order takeout at least twice a week. Plus, ingredients are highly processed, but back then, it was simply part of everyday life. Preparing meals by hand not only supported a healthier body but also reinforced family routines and shared meal times, creating a rhythm that inadvertently kept people naturally lean. We touched on portion control at home, but it was definitely an unspoken rule in Britain, even in restaurants back during the 1960s. The servings were modest and carefully designed to provide nourishment in minimal quantities. These days, everything is supersized and everyone always eats more than they need to when they order. Even if you're feeling full, you're going to end up eating anything left on the plate to make sure that nothing is wasted, so the bigger portion size automatically adds to your calories. At home, plates were filled with just enough food to satisfy each member of the family, and extra food just wasn't made. Even Sunday roasts were calculated, and this helps naturally regulate calorie intake by reducing the risk of overeating. Small portions also encouraged slower eating, which meant that your body would have enough time to tell you when it became full, so you didn't end up feeling hungry after the meal. It was all part of the practical cultural habits that shaped eating patterns and kept calorie consumption in check. Now, the lack of sugary snacks is also a major reason we were skinnier. In the 1960s, candy, chocolate bars and biscuits were considered treats rather than something you had constantly lying around in the house. Unlike today, where you can easily find sweets and sugary snacks. Back then, there was minimal refined sugar in diets. Children might enjoy a small sweet after school, and adults could have an occasional chocolate bar, but culturally, we didn't eat them so often. This limited exposure to sugar helped regulate appetite and energy intake. Refined sugar is known to spike blood sugar levels and contribute to cravings, which can lead to overeating. By consuming sugar sparingly, people naturally maintained a more stable weight. Homemade cakes, jams and biscuits did exist, but were often shared among families and made in small quantities, which also meant that you weren't overeating them. Another contributing factor was the cost and availability of sugary foods. Imported chocolates and confectionaries were relatively expensive, so families reserved them for special occasions. Because there was less available, it meant that no one was eating as much. While nostalgic memories of small sweet indulgences like jam rolly polis remain for many, the limited presence of sugary snacks in daily life was a crucial factor in why Britons were generally leaner. Soft drinks and fizzy beverages were not a daily staple in 1960s Britain, unlike right now when we have sodas, energy drinks or anything sugary every day. The typical household relied on water, tea, milk, and occasionally fruit juices which were normally fresh. Not saying that sodas didn't exist, they just weren't being drunk on a regular basis. And since they weren't consumed as much, it meant that no one had a huge amount of liquid calories and sugar in their system. Modern sodas can add hundreds of empty calories per day without providing any nutrition, which significantly increases weight gain. Back then, even tea didn't have as much sugar put into it, if any at all, and fruit juices weren't heavily sweetened. Minimal soft drink consumption, combined with smaller meals and whole foods, helped maintain energy balance and prevented excessive weight gain. In retrospect, the simplicity of beverages in that era contributed quietly but powerfully to naturally lean physiques. Then there was the fact that we were walking constantly. Not everyone had cars, and most people took the bus or public transport, and that meant you had to actually walk to the stop since there weren't any Ubers or cabs around. So it was natural exercise that you needed to do and were completely used to. Children walked to school or cycled around the area and played out on the streets or in parks. But the walking bit was extremely important. Walking as a daily necessity helped regulate appetite and maintained cardiovascular health. Unlike today, where you lounge around most of the time and use lifts instead of climbing stairs, the act of simply getting from place to place contributed significantly to how many calories we burned through. In the 60s, most jobs also meant a lot of physical effort. These included tough jobs like working in factories, farms, construction sites, and even things like plumbing and carpentry were harder because there weren't a lot of power tools available. Even the lawnmowers had to be manually pushed. As such, there was just a lot of exercise involved, even if we don't take walking into consideration. This constant activity meant that even more energy was needed to function. The body was in motion for most of the day, burning fat and maintaining muscle tone without the need for structured exercise routines or gym memberships. It's nothing like today, where we mostly just sit around in front of one screen or another. We've talked a lot about adults having to move more, but kids back then were the same. There were only a small number of channels and shows, there weren't any smartphones and minimal video games. So what was there for fun? Playing outside. Streets, parks and schoolyards were alive with games like hopscotch, football, tag and hide and seek, which often continued for hours. Kids weren't just sitting around and looking at the walls, and I'm sure there were a bunch of other games that you remember playing with your friends. Then there was also a lot of walking or cycling and doing chores around the house, or maybe helping with delivering things to the neighbours. This constant movement not only burned calories but also promoted healthy muscle and bone development, laying the foundation for a naturally leaner adult physique. The combination of structured daily movement and free play created a lifestyle where excess weight gain was unlikely. Today, kids spend more time inside their homes, just lounging around playing video games or scrolling on phones, which leads to more weight gain and worse physical health. Another major reason was that snacking between main meals was pretty uncommon in the 60s. The concept of grazing, meaning eating small portions constantly throughout the day, was largely unknown. Meals were structured. You had breakfast after waking up, then a proper lunch and proper dinner. Not a constant load of snacks whenever you feel even slightly peckish. This pattern naturally limited calorie intake and helped the body regulate appetite efficiently. People didn't reach for chips, chocolate or biscuits on a whim, and even children knew that there was a fixed time to eat with everyone in the family. This habit of limited snacking worked hand in hand with portion control and homemade meals. The body had time to process food, hunger cues were respected, and energy balance was maintained without conscious dieting. In a world where processed snacks are everywhere today, the lack of grazing culture in 1960s, Britain stands out as a major reason why people stayed naturally slim. Another major reason was the lack of fast food chains. There were a few chains around here and there, but not like today when you can basically find a McDonald's or KFC in pretty much every corner. Takeaway culture was only in its beginning stages, and again, most meals were home-cooked. The absence of fast food also meant that people rarely consumed meals loaded with fats, sugars and refined carbohydrates outside the home, since even the restaurants had less processed foods and smaller portions. Convenience meals, which are now a major contributor to obesity, simply weren't part of everyday life. Another massive factor were the habits enforced during the war. Many families were still adjusting to economic austerity and smaller household budgets, which meant that meals had to be carefully planned and resources were still being rationed in the post-war era. Wastage was minimal and everyone was still very frugal because of the hardship ingrained in them. The economy was also such that imported goods like chocolates, sweets and drinks were expensive, and everyone was just more practical with how they spent money. In addition, the habit of meal planning and budgeting meant that snacking and overeating were naturally limited. People ate what they needed and nothing. Back then, another major factor was that people weren't driven towards emotional eating, and there are a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, advertisements back then focused on product features and not emotional triggers. You didn't see ads saying, "You deserve this chocolate after a hard day at work." The overall mentality of the people at that time was different too. They were harder and stronger emotionally, and emotional restraint was valued. People were less likely to turn to food for comfort, and more likely to keep calm and carry on. Then there was the fact that communities were more tightly knit, and instead of going towards the freezer for a tub of ice cream, you'd go to a friend or neighbour to relax and unwind. Plus, because of the lack of sugar in everything, there was also the fact that your brain didn't crave it as much to feel better. These days, modern life is fast-paced, digitally saturated, and often isolating. Food becomes a quick fix for anxiety, boredom, or sadness. Then you end up seeing something to eat on social media and end up just going for a bite since you can just order it, and it's delivered to your home. Those calories really pile up. Speaking of, in essence, there was the cultural view that food was meant for survival, and not always seen as a form of entertainment. It was made to be fuel, and not as a source of pleasure, stress relief, or social engagement like these days. Although family meals did have a social component, this mindset kept overeating in check, as snacking and excessive indulgence were not normalized. This cultural perspective also reinforced restraint and appreciation. Children learned to eat what was prepared and finish meals without, while adults avoided high-calorie, processed snacks. By treating food as fuel, Britons maintained a healthy energy balance, supporting naturally lean bodies. Even today, the contrast is striking. Modern diets often equate eating with entertainment, and you need to make food fun to eat. Back then, even boiled potatoes without excessive flavours were enough to be satisfying. Another major factor was that being overweight wasn't as acceptable back then as it is now. The average body size was smaller, and being overweight was less common. That made larger bodies stand out more, often attracting unwanted attention or ridicule. Yes, people were mean. Terms like fat or chubby were used casually, even in media and advertising, without the sensitivity we expect today. Obesity was often seen purely as a health failure or moral weakness, like letting yourself go rather than a complex issue involving genetics, environment, and psychology. Even the media focused on thin physiques. Models, film stars, and pop icons were overwhelmingly thin. There was little representation of diverse body types, and larger bodies were often used as comic relief. Because of these factors, everyone just kept themselves in check and stayed thin as a community. Another surprising fact was that smoking was widespread in the UK during the 1960s, and it also influenced body weight. Nicotine basically suppresses appetite, and regular smokers just ate less. Smoking was socially accepted, and people didn't know just how bad of a habit it was back then. Around 70% of men and 40% of women smoked in the UK during the early 1960s. This habit meant that some individuals naturally maintained lower body weight without dietary restrictions or exercise. While smoking carries significant health risks, its appetite-suppressing effects did contribute to the overall leaner appearance of the population. The final major factor was the availability of produce and food items. People ate fruits, vegetables, and produce that were in season, and meat, dairy, and grains were often sourced locally. Eating seasonally ensured natural variety in the diet and prevented over-reliance on calorie-dense processed ingredients. It also meant that meals were fresher and nutrient-rich, supporting healthy metabolism and appetite regulation. Root vegetables in winter, berries in summer, and locally grown greens provided balanced nutrients throughout the year. This approach kept calorie intake moderate, as foods were consumed when available, rather than in unlimited supply year-round. All these factors combined contributed to why Britons were so skinny in the 1960s. But just goes to show how much things have changed compared to back then, some for the better and some less than ideal. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give this video a like if you remember these habits from the past, or even if you learned something new, and don't forget to subscribe for information. See you next time.